Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Performing Diaspora, the History of Urban Music in Toronto. My name is Francesca D'Amico, the project curator of this year's event, as well as a PhD student studying the history of urban music in the history department here at York University. One of the reasons why I find hip-hop so very fascinating, that is beyond its innovation and its overall aesthetic, is its tremendous ability to tell stories. And so I want to begin this morning by telling 3 stories that will give you a better sense of how today's conference came to be and how it speaks to the mandate of this year's project. In early April, Toronto magazine The Grid published an article titled "Pass the Mic, an Oral History of Much Music," in which they interviewed a series of past and present on-air personalities to talk with them about their experiences working at the cable network. Readers immediately noticed the glaring omission of African Canadian contributions to Much Music's history, given that not a single Black VJ was interviewed. Journalists, academics, and the general public, began rightly articulating legitimate critiques of the magazine's work as an instance of poor journalism and pseudo-historical work. Though readers urged the magazine to be responsible, accountable, humble, and even remorseful, the magazine largely neglected to recognize and admit the culpability in creating and promoting a history that does not reflect and include all of the voices necessary to render it a complete and complex picture. Approximately 13 months earlier, while I was conducting an oral interview with Canadian rapper Maestro, I listened as he retold me a story about his recent attendance at the Ontario Black History Society's Black History Month kickoff. Over the course of the interview, Maestro described the keynote that evening, given by African-Canadian politician, activist, and educator Zanana Akonde. Paraphrasing at the time, he explained that he had been particularly struck by a statement she had made in which she said, quote, "Effective efforts are being made to control our stories," end quote. Our being the African-Canadian story. For those of us who are academics in the room, we know that the federal government has recently taken some very shocking steps to monitor the kinds of Canadian histories that are present in our schools. The federal government has focused much of its Canadian history campaign on commemorative events and projects, particularly those centered on military contributions that fall under direct cabinet or ministerial control. As such, the work of historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, librarians, and archivists have been under tremendous threat as a consequence of job losses, policy changes, a reduction in federal public funding, and finally, outright surveillance. These new history wars, as our colleague Dr. Sean Courage in York's history department has called them, are battles not over the meaning of Canadian history, but over the public financing of historical research and preservation. Though it was in the 1990s that Canadian historians had engaged in what is now perhaps called the old history wars, in which some historians expressed their discontent over a shift from the national political histories of Canada towards a much wider spectrum of academic inquiry that considered and privileged the stories of women, racialized Canadians, and labor, it has become clear to me in considering these 3 stories of The Grid magazine, Maestro's oral interview, and the recent developments in the new history wars, that for those historians who continue to dig in the trenches of Canada's neglected histories in particular, the war is not yet over. For those who study African Canadian history especially, they will each tell you that the battle to highlight and incorporate Black Canadian stories into Canadian history has been a difficult process, given that the Black presence in Canada has long been treated with ambivalence. Efforts to affirm African Canadian belonging have ranged from reluctant recognition to their contributions to their complete erasure from the national memory. And so much of the work that these historians produce reminds us that the battle to reproduce a balanced picture of Canada's history is ongoing, far long after historians officially stopped publicly debating over the meaning of Canadian history in the 1990s. In light of today, the question then is, where does hip-hop fit in? Hip-hop, I think, allows us to reimagine Canadian history and challenge these ongoing attempts to erase Black contributions, as in the case of The Grid magazine, and to control African Canadian stories, as in the example of Maestro's oral history that he illuminated to. The culture's most enduring legacy is its ability to speak of, to speak to, and to speak back. It is an Afro-diasporic art form that speaks of the environment that it sees before it. It speaks to youth especially, but also to racialized communities, men and women, and so forth. and it speaks back to the societal structures of domination present in the lives of everyday people. In Canada, all of the ways in which hip-hop speaks of, to, and back are uniquely Canadian, and in this case today, uniquely Torontonian. What Canadian hip-hop has long offered to its listeners is a needed critique that exposes Canada's real histories, its social relations and interactions, and the racialized code that produces Canada as a white nation. Hip-hop practitioners have long used the culture to articulate their visibility, claim the space and ability to speak, and privilege their voices as valuable. In doing so, they have used popular culture to help destabilize our ideas about Canada by including those who are often forgotten, excluded, or erased from Canada's history as well as its present. As such, Canadian hip-hop deserves to be treated seriously, both academically and as a viable popular culture contribution. Academically, scholars can use hip-hop as a site to discuss issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, the body, urban development, and notions of national and local citizenship. As a popular culture form, we can use Canadian hip-hop to discuss how practitioners have used the culture as a site to contest, negotiate, and expose the shortcomings and falsehoods of multiculturalism and Canadian realities. The history of hip-hop in Toronto is incredibly unique, rich, and multifaceted, and yet the histories and the range of the stories of our practitioners, particularly our own pioneers, and the ways in which the culture has developed since the 1980s has largely been overshadowed by the dominant narrative of American hip-hop. And so today, it is our hope that we can bring together the work of a new generation of hip-hop scholars, who the first panel here is found before you, as well as some of Toronto's pioneering MCs and a wide range of hip-hop professionals and media personalities throughout the day on a single stage to promote research and share knowledge about the diversity and complexity of hip-hop in Toronto. As well, we hope to discuss the challenges posed by the Canadian music industry and how it has envisioned and at times problematically failed to imagine and incorporate hip-hop as part of its broader popular culture. Given the mandate of one of our two major sponsors, the Harriet Tubman Institute for research on the global migrations of African people, today is most strongly intended to use hip-hop to explore the life experiences and celebrate the contributions of African-descended people in Canada. As a historian, I know how important it is to learn from our elders, whomever they may be, of what has come before us, and most importantly, to document it. And so it is imperative that we as a city take this moment today to hear the history of Toronto hip-hop from the very people who helped create and sustain its foundation and who continue to nourish the culture as it moves forward into the future. Before we officially begin, I would like to first thank all of you on behalf of the organizing committee for coming out this morning. It is our hope that you truly engage and enjoy the day's events. I would now like to welcome Dr. William Jenkins to the podium, who brings greetings from one of the conference's co-presenters, York University's History Department. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Francesca. I'm William Jenkins. I'm the Graduate Program Director in the Department of History here at York, and I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks again for the invite. I think it's wonderful that Francesca and the organizing committee have been able to stage what must be one of the first conferences of its type, that is a conference dedicated to the history of urban music, whether in Toronto or anywhere else. And they have clearly put together a very impressive lineup of speakers and participants. For my part, I was born and raised a long way from the epicenter of hip-hop or rap, even within Europe. I was born in Dublin. But if we leave to one side the question of what exactly urban music is and think about the relationship between music and cities, the experience of living in cities, then music was everywhere in the city of my birth. We had and we have busking musicians on the street. We don't have subways in Dublin, so you see the street musicians above the ground. We had music in independent record stores, if anyone actually remembers independent record stores. They meant a lot to me as I began my vinyl collection sometime in the middle of the 1980s and plastered my denim jacket with logos of Iron Maiden and Motorhead. We also have music in bars, acoustic music, electric music, sometimes impromptu, sometimes spontaneous, and music in more formal venues such as concert halls and clubs. But behind the scenes, of course, we had also the centers of music production, such as recording studios. But at the time, I was very much a record consumer. But cities change and their population structures transform, and the sounds that are processed within them also change. There's nothing strange about newcomers arriving to a new city and shaking things up culturally, including musically. And Toronto is clearly a different kind of city today than it was in, say, 1970. And from what I've been told about Toronto in 1970, it was clearly in need of a bit of a shake-up. 3 years earlier, Canadian immigration policy changed, and we entered the so-called era of multiculturalism in Canada, with Toronto as its seeming epicenter. But Toronto has also become known and perhaps marketed as a city of neighborhoods, defined by various mixes of class, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and race. And from some of these neighborhoods have sprung what we now come to understand as Toronto's particular brand of urban music, with narrations of place and the urban and suburban experiences, with all of their opportunities and obstacles reflected in lyrics and in sound. Patterns of socialization, however crafted, result in newcomers identifying with neighborhoods and other suburban and urban territories in their search for belonging and identity, using language and sound to declare where they fit in Canadian society, if indeed they feel they fit in at all. And perhaps there is where the word diaspora is particularly useful. At this point, it might be worth asking how historians deal with the question of music. And for those of you who think that historians spend their time looking through the private correspondence of Sir John A. Macdonald and Winston Churchill, as Francesca will have told you, you're wrong. Cultural and social historians in particular have dealt with the question of music in the past and in the urban past, especially. To take some not too distant examples, with the rise of public concert halls in the 19th century came the elaboration of genteel and bourgeois middle-class identities in Europe and North America. Concert halls were and are very particular types of venue with their own codes of behavior and assumed knowledge about the performers. At the same time, working class and immigrant populations had their less formal venues from which decidedly different and more vulgar words and sounds rang out. These songs were not always celebrations of life in the city. Irish immigrants, for example, had their songs about the pain of emigration, songs about the homeland, songs about British colonialism, songs that, when sung, fortified their determination that future generations would resist and correct the injustices of history. But some historians are moving closer to the present, one such being Lee Michael Harrison, who in the prestigious Journal of Social History in 2010 published the article entitled Factory Music: How the Industrial Geography and Working Class Environment of Post-War Birmingham Fostered the Birth of Heavy Metal. Here, Harrison traces how the alienated working class youth of 1960s Birmingham, an English city scarred by destruction in World War II, incorporated sounds from the industrial factories which dominated their lives and expressed their working class frustration and anger lyrically, spawning bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest. Now, this is not, of course, the urban music we're dealing with today, but it does invite us to think critically about this label, urban. At the more local level, we have a number of PhD students in the graduate program in history here at York, Francesca included, who are exploring various relationships between late 20th century musical genres such as soul, funk, rock, and hip-hop, and wider social formations, whether defined by class, race, or gender, as well as movements dedicated to political reform in the United States and Canada. And 3 years ago, for example, I was lucky enough to be a second reader on a master's research paper on the Toronto reggae scene of the 1970s and 80s. And I think it's a truly marvelous and uplifting thing to see that music, and popular music especially, is now finally being taken seriously by academic historians. This is something about which I'm extremely jealous, by the way. I think if I was a PhD student now, I would have done something completely different to what I did do for my PhD. In any event, I feel that today's conference marks another milestone along that road for social, cultural, and urban history. And in addition to thanking once again the organizers for all their hard work, I wish all of you a most enjoyable and stimulating conference today at York University.